Hello everyone, and welcome back to Demon City Shinjuku, the newest horror story that we're reading on the channel. Hello Delvin, Jeff, Daniel, Artemis, Akatsuki, Berserker. Thank you guys for joining us. Yes, time for more anime tropes, the novel, that is correct. If you didn't tune in last time, or you want to catch up, remember what we were reading. We were reading a horror story by Hideyuki Kikuchi, where a terrible earthquake hit an area of Tokyo called Shinjuku and totally obliterated it. And sometime after, I think it's like 20 years or something, it's a while, a young boy is called upon by the world government to save the world from an evil man that wants to summon Satan, basically. To make a long story short, they spent a lot of time talking in circles about demon summoning. And so now, we are back to our young boy. Oh, I think the music might be a little loud. Here, let me know how the music sounds. We are back with Kyoya is our hero. Hello, Adrian. Welcome. It was around 11 when Kyoya got home. His aunt and uncle took seriously the motto early to bed, early to rise, and were already asleep. 11 doesn't seem that early to me, but okay. A couple of home delivery food packs were waiting in the kitchen, not uncommon in this neighborhood. The nightlife of the young had grown later and later over the years. The PTA blamed for one Tokyo's 24-hour automated bus service. Okay. A food pack could preserve and keep its contents heated for up to 3 days. After opening and consuming them, Kyoya went upstairs to his room. From a locker recessed into the wall, he took out a wooden sword in a clothed sheath. It was called Asura, after the Hindu archangel, and was the only remaining memento of his father. When he was a boy, his father had placed the sword in his hands, carved from the branch of an evergreen oak on Mount Girdharakur. This is an Indian word, Sanskrit word, I think, and I'm having trouble. Girdharakuta. Probably still wrong, but my best guess is Girdhartuka. Trained him in the art of Nempo. He removed the sheath, stood in the middle of the room, and settled into an on-guard position, the blade of the sword centered and the tip rising to the height of an opponent's eyes. His palms melded to the hilt. A warmth and a power flowed through the connection. The mental energy is instilled in Asura by his father, Genichiro. Even to a prodigy like Kyoya, his father's skills as a fencer were truly awesome. In his twilight years, those extraordinary talents seemed to diminish, such that he lost 2 out of 3 matches to Kyoya. But Kyoya was not convinced he'd gotten that much better, or his father that much worse. Rather, wielding the sword with all his might and heart had smithed his spirit into the sword. His father's will resided in Asura. Not surprising, considering the opponent. However reluctant, this untested son would have to fall back on his father's strength. Fun fact, Asura is, as it says, a Hindu term. I've never heard of it referred to as a Hindu archangel. Asura, to my knowledge, is a type of demon, but it's very likely that there's as wide and variety as there is in Hinduism. I would not be surprised if Asura refers to many different people and creatures. I'm actually going to go ahead and get a lozenge because my weak voice has been giving out on me this week. Hello, Murky. Welcome. Kyoya was ready to leave. He couldn't explain himself how things had gotten to this point. This had nothing to do with the efforts of Master Rai and Section Chief Yamashina to persuade him. In fact, after Master Rai disappeared, Yamashina and Sayaka had left the room without saying another word. To start with, he had plans. His path after graduation was already mapped out. He'd applied for and been awarded an athletics scholarship to the Earth Federation base on Phobos. He had a hard time believing a sorcerer's curses could run after him all the way to Mars. Then why? Although he'd posed the question to the master, Kyoya actually did understand where his father was coming from. The purpose of his training was, as the master explained, The reason he'd kept mum about it were also becoming clear. He didn't want me carrying that burden through my childhood. Suppose that he knew his son was predestined from the start. Kyoya knew perfectly well his father wasn't the type to keep something like that buttoned up because he figured his son would find out about it sooner or later. He certainly understood Kyoya's character. Spill the beans just once, and no matter how contrary he might be, in the end he would always return to the scene of the battle. His father couldn't bear his son living a life so utterly predetermined from the start. Then why didn't he slacken the training until the day he collapsed? He must have felt the fever coming on as he practiced Kenpo in the bitter cold of the mountains. A few afters after Kyoya found him, he died with the single word Shinjuku on his lips. Because he believed in me. Not because it was something he was fated to do, but because it was something he would choose of his own free will. Though that wasn't what now propelled him on his way. Her face rose up in his thoughts. Her long black hair, that translucent young lady, fighting back the tears. She must be 16 or so. Am I doing it for her? He didn't know the answer. Among all the reasons, it was probably the one closest to the truth. Well, good enough for him. Racking his brains over it wouldn't do him any good. Every cell of his body was brimming with energy. His and his father's souls fusing together in Asura, giving birth to psychic energies of unimaginable power. He had unfailingly taken 100 practice swings morning and night in order to savor that sensation, as if his body was being turned into a fusion reactor. The question was, how well could he control it? Kyoya took another object from the back of the locker, a carved wooden doll a foot tall, of an African medicine man with a bow in his hand. The dark paint had worn away in places, exposing the grain beneath. It was clearly an antique, though it didn't look particularly valuable. A rather odd touch was that the arrow notched in the bow was sticking into the man's chest. Kyoya set the doll in the middle of the floor and removed the arrow. He placed it in the empty hand and quickly backed away, and once again assumed an on-guard pose. Several seconds passed. The doll grinned. Simultaneously, the room transformed. Water erupted violently out of the computer display unit, met by a spray of fire from the wall opposite, resulting in an ear-splitting explosion that shook the air. The entire room shuddered. The rollaway desk and the bed danced through the air, along with the digital notepad and electromagnetic pen and trinkets and gifts from his girlfriends. A poltergeist at work. Amidst the ceaseless roar and maddeningly flying objects, Kyoya stood there motionless, eyes half closed. The doll opened its red mouth and laughed a piercing, loud laugh. Now, we're going to read some things this book is going to say about voodoo that are not voodoo. I mean, I really don't think they are. And I don't know how much knowledge of voodoo really would have existed in Japan in the 1980s, but he's going to make some statements that I just don't think are correct. This was an African voodoo doll, for one. African voodoo doll, not some... Anyway, I will not quibble. This was an African voodoo doll. When a witch doctor was asked to place a spell on a bitter rival, he would secret the doll somewhere in his house. It would draw the wandering spirits and trigger supernatural events. The poltergeist was one of them. Even after the phenomenon ended, the unleashed miasmas and noxious odors would render the place unlivable. Actions of evil spirits could only be countered by being sealed with stronger magic, or by destroying the poltergeist itself. Either way, an arduous task. If a medium were in the room now, it would witness a horde of elated apparitions whirling about. The doll notched the arrow into the bowstring. Kyoya raised Asura over his head. As if by a previous arrangement, the mad dancers retreated to the corners of the room. In the middle of the bed covers, a huge mouth opened up and bared its fangs. The arrow shot across the room, growing in midair to a yard in length, straight at Kyoya's heart. The thing in the bed sprang at him as well. Yah! With a shattering cry that could tear the walls in two, Kyoya brought Asura down in a sweeping arc. The air trembled. A flash of silver light shot at the doll's chest. A moment later, he stood alone in the room, as calm and quiet as the autumn night. Everything was back to normal, the same as before the doll smiled. The only difference was that the doll had toppled over. The arrow protruded from its chest. What was odd about it was a slight twist about halfway down the shaft, as if it had ricocheted off something. Kyoya wordlessly picked up the doll and put it back in the locker. Just to make sure, he opened the door and peeked into the hallway. There was no sign this late-night racket had disturbed his aunt and uncle. Not a single sound had leaked out of his room. Good enough, he murmured to himself. He propped Asura against the bed and packed his bag. He'd summoned the poltergeist to test his might, mind, and intention, his Nen. The doll had long been a favorite sparring partner in that regard. When his and his father's Nen fused together, frightening results could spring from its misuse. A light jab against a human opponent could crush his skull. A tap with the pinky could shatter the heart. Kyoya had once knocked a truck running a red light into the river with a single sweep of Asura. When it was pulled out of the water, it wasn't damaged. Nothing appeared wrong with it, but it would never work again. When wielded as a physical manifestation of willpower, without the accompanying purification that Nen inculcated, his thought could become nothing more than a crude, lethal weapon. Kyoya wasn't sure he had yet reached that stage. That was why he invited the poltergeist to take him on, testing himself, confronting the threat with a single blow at a minimal projection of Nen, and then dispersing them without annihilating them. When he said good enough, he was referring to those possibilities of control. Yeah, that's my point there when I said African voodoo. There's a lot to talk about voodoo, and specifically how it's been really misunderstood in pop culture because it just kind of like word of mouth rumor, it became to be associated with things that it's not. And for the most part, it's far more a diaspora tradition that you could probably find roots of in Africa, but not as voodoo, as other things that became transformed by, people being taken across the ocean and enslaved and all this stuff. Long history, but anyway, most writers who throw voodoo in as part of their, spooky horror story have no idea what they're talking about. I'm a little more lenient here with this dude because it was 1980, and I don't know how much that kind of knowledge would have... I don't think voodoo is a living religion in Japan, you know what I mean? Probably just heard of it through, American stories, which, again, would not have been presented correctly. Anyway. After a few more minutes, he had everything ready to go. To allow him maximum movement, he put on a pair of stretch jeans and a training jacket. His only luggage was a nylon day bag stuffed with a change of clothes, towel, toothbrush, and toiletries. He'd pulled 5,000 yen out of the ATM on his way home. He didn't imagine a credit card would do him much good where he was going. He wouldn't mind carrying some Shorinji Kenpo hidden weaponry into the battle, such as shuriken and tetsuga and iron pills, but he didn't have any on hand. So that was that. He left his aunt and uncle a letter stating he'd be going on a trip for 3 days. He played hooky all the time to take off to parts unknown, so it wouldn't be anything to worry about. But Kyoya wasn't sure he'd be back in 3 days. Not waiting for morning, Kyoya left the slumbering abode. According to the glowing face of his watch, it was midnight, the 10th of September. 3 days and 3 hours were left. He could drop by the Information Bureau and have a detailed knowledge of Shinjuku implanted via their auto-suggestion devices, but gave it a pass. He wouldn't be doing himself any favors trying to take shortcuts at this stage in the game. As he hurried down the midnight streets to the robot bus stop, Kyoya addressed Asura in his left hand. He was committing himself to this course. Like you said, of my own free will. It was a little late to be sorry about being such an unreliable son. But right now, Dad, I'm going to need all the strength you can give me. Then he shrugged. No matter what, he still had to wonder how an ordinary high school student ended up going to a place like that. Demon City. We're going to Demon City! There's an anime. Yes, there is. There's an anime movie. There's also a live adaptation. I think it might be a Chinese movie? I don't know. Called Wicked City. One of these days I'll buy it, but it's like $60 on DVD, and I just want it. Yeah, I think there's a few, and there's also mangas, adaptations of both of these books, and a third one called Demon City Hunter, that I don't know if that's based on a book or not. It's a little sketchy because not everything he wrote has been translated into English, and not all of it was finished translating, especially his early stuff. So both Demon City Shinjuku and Demon City Babylon, or Demon Palace Babylon were translated. I don't know if there was a third book that wasn't. Yeah, we do need to watch it. When we finish reading this, we will watch it. What happened to his dad? He died before the events of the book, like lung cancer or something, I think. All right. Part 3. The ruins stretched out before him. Beneath the cold autumn moonlight, the black mountains of bricks and shattered concrete went on and on. Somewhere in the darkness, a wild beast howled. Judging from the lights, people must be living here. Not only that, but as he focused his gaze hither and yon in the rolling hills of rubble, the outlines of buildings and unit housing came into view. One structure soared toward the heavens, another squatted next to the earth, indistinguishable from the surrounding wreckage. If he concentrated even more far in the distance, he could make out the innumerable lights dotting the periphery, like the guard towers of a penitentiary. The watchtowers of a prison. The metaphor was not necessarily inappropriate. The lights came from the windows and neon signs of the surrounding skyscrapers. To the north, the former Omiya and Kawagoe. To the south, Miura Peninsula dividing Tokyo and Yokohama. To the east, Narita. And to the west, Hachioji. In one corner of the Tokyo megalopolis, these sad and abhorrent remains were exposed for all to see. They called it Demon City for short. As if endeavoring to illustrate the source of that unfortunate name, a sense of dread surrounded the environs. It wasn't only felt in the air, but somehow stained the starlight and moonlight as well. And the cold. Not that of a winter's night, but a chill that reached into the heart and soul. The cold of the wayward spirits, embracing the visitor with unease and fear. What was Demon City? It was once Shinjuku. Back when Tokyo was still the Tokyo of old, the wards of Yodobashi, Yotsuya, and Ushigome had been merged into a single city. It covered 7 square miles, or approximately 4,500 acres. At the turn of the millennium, its population reached 200,000. I'm so bad at numbers. My dyscalculia! 270000. That many people. Shinjuku Station occupied the city center. The Tokyo Metropolitan Government Complex, Kabukicho, Hanazono, and the 5 buildings of the skyscraper district comprised the heart of the new city and its world-renowned shopping and entertainment district. The flow of the young and the adventurous went on all day and all night, until that fall night of September 13th. That day, the entirety of Shinjuku, indeed only Shinjuku, was leveled by a magnitude 8.5 earthquake directly beneath the city. Even worse, it struck like a surprise attack at 3 o'clock in the morning. Since the 1980s, preparing for the next predicted big one to strike Tokyo, predicted to occur around the Izu Peninsula, the building codes had been modified to increase the earthquake resistance of the architecture. But the solidly built reinforced steel and concrete structures and prefabricated residential wooden houses crumbled like paper mache in the face of this earthquake. Oh, hello, Cheska. I hope I said your name right. Feel free to correct me if I didn't. Greetings from Manila. Oh, cool. Well, thank you for joining us. Let's see, who else? Hello, Marianor. And Handsome Ratch, welcome. If my city was... I'd love it if my city was named Wicked City or Demon City. I like Wicked City. That sounds badass to me. I like it. And Wicked City, I don't know technically if it's... I'm pretty sure it's a spin-off, because Wicked City is a trilogy of books he wrote later on that I think are also based in Demon City Shinjuku, but they're not, I think, directly related to these books. They're more like police procedurals in a Demon City. They were some of the most expensive books of his I've ever bought. I'm obsessed. I have to own all his books. I'm missing like 2, I think. I'll have to double check that. Alright, where was I? The pedestrians and homeowners sleeping soundly in their beds, the nightlife revelers, all that concrete and steel became an avalanche that swept them away unmercifully and without distinction. In a normal earthquake, the fires sparked in residential housing often posed a bigger threat than the collapsing structures. In this earthquake alone, 80% of the dead were killed in the first heave of the earth. There were no aftershocks. Even the Great Japan Meteorological Agency abandoned the designation Great Shinjuku Earthquake in favor of Devil Quake, as the latter perfectly captured its nature and effect, unlike any that had come before. Aw, thank you for the support, Daniel. First of all, the damage did not extend any further than Shinjuku proper. For example, the Chuo line running from Ichigaya to Iidabashi was bordered on the east by Chiyoda Ward and on the west by Shinjuku Ward. The station employees on duty at Iidabashi could look across the outer moat of the Imperial Palace towards the soaring structures of Ichigaya and watch as they collapsed with a deafening roar, while on their side of the moat, not even the air stirred. They slapped their cheeks, thinking they must be dreaming. That's how they described the experience. As a result, even when the information was relayed to the fire and police departments, they didn't take it seriously at first, delaying rescue operations. The Devil Quake was clearly limited to Shinjuku, or rather, it specifically targeted Shinjuku. Even within Shinjuku, the wreckage was distributed in a random fashion. The Isetan Mitsukoshi, Odakuya, and Keio Station department stores were leveled, while the Keio Plaza Hotel, the Sumitomo Bank Triangle Building, and the rest of the Shinjuku skyscraper district suffered little more than cracks in the walls and broken windows. When the big one hit, Chuo Park, a stone's throw away, despite being designated as an evacuation center, saw trees and shrubs yanked out by the roots, the ground tossed like the waves of the sea, as if the gods of the earth had gone mad and bolted for the surface. Elsewhere, the pleasure quarters of Kabukicho and Hanazono presented the cruel irony of flattened wooden residents, while the surrounding buildings managed to maintain their outward appearances. At the same time, the Shinjuku Ward Building, the Koma Theater, and the Pension Fund Association Building had their facades stripped away, but remained standing. It was as if a giant catfish buried deep in the sludge had woken up and haphazardly thrashed about without rhyme or reason. Had the destruction been confined to such irrationally distributed damage alone, the epithets of Devil Quake and Demon City should not have stuck. The portents were there all along, but its truly haunted nature didn't become apparent until the reconstruction efforts began. One day, 2 weeks later, the disposal of the corpses was almost complete, and the removal of the debris was underway. A work site that, from all appearances, was solid ground, suddenly gave way, and a dozen remote-operated bulldozers and cranes were swallowed up in the gaping pit. This was just the beginning. Inexplicable phenomena began popping up over the ruins all over Shinjuku. 5 old-style M1 Abram tanks on loan from the U.S. Army to the Ministry of Defense in Ichigaya were trapped in a fissure. During the frantic recovery process, one of the guards let loose with an M91 assault rifle, and before he was gunned down, he killed 12 of his fellow soldiers. The bullets punctured the reserve fuel tanks of the heavy-duty crane, turning the recovery site into an inferno. The reason for the shooting incident is still unknown. 20 patrol officers mustered into duty after the disaster to suppress riots and prevent looting of precious metals were found torn to pieces in the police dormitory on the grounds of Hanazono Shrine. Their bodies were drenched with blood and water. Before being chewed to death, several of them had, in fact, drowned. Hello, Ball-Jointed Wing. Thanks for joining us. Corpses were missing, and were later observed walking down Yasukuni Avenue, their insides falling out. Bye, Ratch. Have a good one. The dissonance between that sentence and me being like, oh, bye. Corpses went missing and were later observed walking down Yasukuni Avenue, their insides falling out. Eerie screams were heard coming from the ruins of a certain building. The soldiers from the Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces sent in to investigate never returned. The supernatural phenomenon never ceased. Scientists were appointed to investigate the incidences, but once they had ascertained that the causes did not conform to any known natural laws, the committee was disbanded, without coming to any conclusions, except that the Airbus the scientists were scheduled to leave Shinjuku in was destroyed just before their departure, and those scientists never made it home again. A high priest was invited to conduct a requiem for the dead. While reciting the sutras, a gust of wind brushed against the side of his face. A second later, his body dissolved into a muddy puddle of melted flesh as his white bones continued to chatter the sutras. The Prime Minister was in attendance and witnessed the whole thing. Half a year later, he called a halt to the reconstruction efforts in Demon City. And so the name Demon City came into being. Ever since then, drawn to the magical miasma springing to life in Shinjuku, a whole new host of residents came to call Demon City their home. Outlaws on the lam, from run-of-the-mill swindlers and petty thieves down to the vilest robbers and murderers. Yakuza and street gangs too violent by the standards of life outside Shinjuku. They soon graduated from the old tools of the trade, like knives and chains, to large-bore laser weapons in their killing sprees. They were followed by the kingpins organizing around them factions and cabals, extending the reach of their power and influence. As time went on, the residents of Shinjuku grew more and more varied in kind and personality. During the late 20-teens, in conjunction with the expedited World Federation space exploration efforts, a large number of space cyborgs had been sent from Earth throughout the solar system. Many were injured or failed to adapt to the alien environments and returned to Earth. But a faltering economy and difficulty finding gainful employment also put them on the road to Shinjuku. What is a sutra? That is a Buddhist term. Well, it may originate elsewhere, but in Buddhism, it refers to one of the teachings of the Buddha, something that he specifically it comes from the Buddhist religious texts and is read aloud and is meant to have some kind of meaning, or often in fiction to have magical power. So he is reading from Buddhist religious texts that are meant to, in this case, I think they were saying it was a funeral, but in a lot of fiction, you'll find them using sutras as like magical attacks. Sayuki comes to mind. The bewitched atmosphere of Demon City may have proved a comforting fit for their ravaged minds. In that respect, espers as well proved no less an onerous presence. At the turn of the millennium, ESP research had produced equipment that could detect dormant ability and develop its potential power. A significant number of otherwise normal people with ESP abilities, both dormant and active, emerged. Along with these advances came testing and ranking on a worldwide scale. As a result, top-grade espers were required to register with the World Federation. Some insisted on freedom and rights and refused, and an illegal esper movement began. Obtaining their own equipment through back channels, they amped up their abilities to frightening levels and began to pull off daring and dastardly crimes. Shinjuku, a den of thieves the law couldn't reach, was perfectly suited for their purposes. In due course, law enforcement organizations around the world united for the purposes of imposing law and order on Shinjuku. Except that when they attempted to reconstitute the regular police force before the Devil Quake, the nightmarish incident slowed activities to a crawl. By this point, garrisons had been located on the borders between Shinjuku and the outside wards, staffed by a small number of regular police and commando units. Demon City had already transformed into a city of supercriminals beyond their ability to manage. Confronting cyborgs equipped with ultrasonic weapons that could reduce ferro-concrete structures to dust in seconds. Degenerate espers who could turn an opponent's brain to mush through thought alone. Yakuza wearing the World Federation Army's prized multifunctional fighting suits. Against the likes of them, the ordinary beat cop armed with 9mm semi-automatics with 10-round magazines and high-voltage nightsticks could accomplish next to nothing. And so, with the scars of the disaster clearly in view, Shinjuku detached itself from civilization, practically from time itself. Now in 2030, in the center of the huge megalopolis of Tokyo, this strange and terrifying crime-ridden city continued to exist in its own twilight world. The pale moonlight shone down on the road snaking through the reeking ruins. The shadow of a slight figure made its way through the old JR Yotsuya station to Yotsuya Sanchome. The outlines of her body glimmering faintly in the darkness, there was enough light to make out a young and pretty woman. Sayaka. That's the president's daughter who we met earlier. Any good things here? Well, if you like monsters. I think it's basically implied that most normal people have left this town. I don't think entirely, but most have. Or just got killed. A look of worry and unease passed across her determined face. Her last hope, Kyoya, had turned her down. After a moment of anguish, she'd bolted from the Information Bureau. To what end? To confront the sorcerer and defeat him. All she had in order to accomplish that goal was a laser ring on her right hand. Out of concern for the activities of anti-Federation factions, she wore it in self-defense. From the outside, it looked like a BB-sized ruby set into a gold mount. Inside was a tiny nuclear reactor and energy converter. Together, they could spit out a laser beam powerful enough to melt glass. Sayaka never liked the idea of having on her person a weapon that could kill people. She had retrofitted it with a paralyzing mode and usually kept it on that setting. No matter how powerful, defeating the sorcerer Ra, of whom it was said there was but one in the world that was his equal, would prove well nigh impossible. Knowing that full well, Sayaka felt she had no choice, both for her father's sake and the sake of the world. Hello, Phantom Punk, welcome. When she'd met with Kyoya at the Information Bureau, saving her father was the only thing on her mind. But as the Master explained the sorcerer's true motives, it kindled in her a renewed responsibility toward the world as a whole. She couldn't say if this was because she was the daughter of the president. When she was younger, she'd been on a relief mission to a refugee camp with her mother, when looters shot her dead without a second thought. The blood her mother spilled for the good of others undoubtedly spurred her on now. But however heroic and high-minded her resolve, she hadn't given any consideration to tracking down her target. She'd sallied forth on the spur of the moment. For a well-bred young lady like herself, this was a bridge too far. She hadn't acted in haste so much as without thinking. The state of her dress and high heels, the same as before, and the way she stumbled and tripped down the road strewn with chunks of concrete and boulders, painted an all too precarious picture. Nevertheless, she managed not to fall and arrived at the Yosuya-Shachome intersection, the result of not only good luck, but sharp senses and reflexes, the same skills that made her captain of her high school Aikido team. She came to a halt in the middle of the intersection. Go straight up, and I'll end up in Shinjuku's old high street. If I turn right, I'll cross Akabona Bridge to the Defense Agency. Left, I'll end up in Shina no Machi Station and Keio Hospital. If I were the bad guys, I'd probably go straight. Before setting out, she'd at least taken the time to make quick use of the auto-suggestion machine that Kyoya hadn't, and flashed her memory with a detailed geographical map of Shinjuku. All right then, she said to herself. I'll keep going in this direction. 2 or 3 steps later, she stopped. She sensed something around her. Several things. Her eyes scanned the darkness to her left and right. Crimson points of light. Eyes. And not just 2 or 3 pairs. The low growls revealed the rapacious nature of these carnivorous beasts. Not man-eating leeches or giant rats. That left 2-headed dogs, and put her in a very tight spot. When it came to dangerous animals, Demon City had its share of completely unique species. Rumor had it that specimens released from a joint public-private gene research laboratory during the Devil Quake had been further mutated by magical miasmas. Among these creatures that would attack anything that moved, the 2-headed dogs reached a good 6 feet in length and would take on a North American grizzly bear. From the prey's perspective, an attack by one was not different than by 2, making them more quadruple the trouble. Shinjuku Ward was surrounded by a fissure hundreds of feet deep and 20 yards wide that effectively kept the beasts penned inside. One good side effect of the Devil Quake. Traffic between Shinjuku and the outside wards was controlled through a series of large gates in Yotsuya, Tsurumachiko, in Waseda, and Yonchome in West Shinjuku. The gates were open 24/7, as were the numerous watchtowers equipped with a full array of electronic monitoring equipment and particle cannon emplacements, turning Shinjuku into the world's most vigilantly guarded zoo. Yes, the damsel is being pretty dumb, isn't she? As expected of a story that is built upon the basest of anime tropes. That's okay, because I love his dark, creepy shit. His books do get quite, well, I don't want to say better, because I don't think this book is bad, especially when you take it in the context of when it was written. Because there's a lot of really fascinating and unique ideas that he, you know, like I have said, spearheaded, as far as, like, the genre and the age when it was written goes. But his later books are far more complex in characterization and ideas, for sure. And I haven't read them all, but I've read a lot of them. The encroaching circle slowly tightened around Sayaka, trembling with the pleasurable promise of the kill, and appetite sated. The growls ceased, perhaps due to the heightened sense of anticipation. The wild feral smell stuck Sayaka's nostrils. One pounced on her from the right, as she expected, a two-headed dog. The twin sets of fangs gnashed at her throat. But Sayaka's throat was no longer there. However prim and privileged she appeared on the outside, she dodged the attack with an unexpected quickness, focusing a paralyzing ray as the dog landed. The big frame toppled over. Sayaka took off before the second one completed its leap. Her memory proved true, and the road sloped down toward the entrance to Shantome Station on the Tokyo Metro Marunouchi line. The roof had fallen in, but the steel shutters were up. The thinking was, rather than staving off a concentrated assault from the street, it was safer to fall back and ambush invaders from within. Dogs came at her from both sides. She hit them with the paralyzer. They fell unconscious, blocking the road. Sayaka leapt like a trout scaling a fish ladder, vaulted over the big canine torsos, and tumbled headfirst through the entranceway. She hit the stairs, somersaulted, and struck the landing. The rush of air lifted her dress, revealing well-formed legs and thighs. She hastily patted it back down again. The move backfired. Raising dreadful howls, a two-headed dog clambered down the stairs. Two mouths gaped wide, red tongues flicking out like flame from beneath its fangs. Her aim was true, but late. Struck by the animal's body, Sayaka tumbled down across the tiled floor, striking the back of her head. Her consciousness wavered. Before her eyes, the pair of mouths and their spiky fangs closed on her, and the head of a different creature behind them. Father! As hope vanished from her thoughts, her father and the face of a young man sprang up in her mind's eye. The raw breath hot on her neck. Sayaka fainted. Ah, yes. As expected. She does get some cool moments, and I really like her as a character, but she is very much traditional anime girlfriend. She was suddenly resting much easier. Along with the smell of burning flesh, primal screams faded to silence. Someone patted her cheeks. "Hang in there, miss." Sayaka opened her eyes. 3 men bent over her. 2 of them wore leather jackets in the street gang style. They were human beings. The other was a cyborg with a hairless metal skull, the heavy-duty interstellar type with especially wide shoulders, a space cyborg. The shorter and smaller of the 2 gangbangers helped her to her feet. 4 two-headed dogs lay on the ground around them, their bodies all scorched, with one still smoldering. A strange smell shrouded the cramped ticket area that made her sick to her stomach. She was still a bit spaced out. She rapped the side of her head and said to her rather rancid rescuers, "Thank you very much." She meant it from the bottom of her heart. "Hey, no problem. Wanted to test fire the little bugger. Turned out pretty handy for black market shit." The short man held up the heater gun in his right hand. He had a kind-hearted face compared to his companions, though that could be because he wasn't missing his eyebrows and nose like the other human. Their clothing and black market weapons identified the 3 as being with one of the many street gangs that ruled Shinjuku. Shorty's big counterpart said, "Looks like the rest took off." He glanced up the staircase. He looked a lot meaner and held a heater as well. Shorty added helpfully, "You gotta be careful about going outside. No telling what could be creepy crawling around out there. You should take a break for a while." Sayaka followed the 3 onto the Marunouchi station platform. She recalled the subway system was hit hard by the Devil Quake. This station, though, seemed to have come through relatively unscathed. Such were the whimsies of the Devil Quake. A portable stove sat in a corner on the Yotsuya-bound side of the platform. Beer bottles and pressurized food containers were scattered about. The fire from the stove lit up the immediate environment. The three must have biovac'd here for the night. Want something to eat? Shorty held out one of the food packs. It was illustrated with a generic picture of stew and had a tiny fork attached. Despite having just narrowly escaped being eaten to death herself, Sayaka was suddenly very hungry. I appreciate it, she said with a nod. She pulled on the ring. With a soft pop, the frozen, pressure-sealed synthetic meat and gravy began to swell and simmer as the chemicals in the thermal pad fused and heated. The pack expanded to the size of a dinner plate. The other two men eyed Sayaka suspiciously as she ate, but didn't interrupt. Once she was finished, she got out her wallet, then realized she didn't have any cash on her. She said apologetically, is there an ATM around here? The three blinked in surprise. Shorty grinned. What, for the food? Nah, it's on the house. No, I really want to compensate you. The big man leaned in and said, in this city, keeping these heater guns of ours charged costs a pretty penny, you know. 50,000 credits for the meal. Hey, Shorty said with a scowl, don't give the little lady a hard time. We're taking 50 tops for that. We're talking 50 tops for that? Big man ignored him. How about it? Gonna pay up? Or maybe you can work it off. Sayaka stared back at him blankly. Saviors turning on a dime into extortionists was a new experience for her. She'd grown up in the harsh environment of the moon colonies, where cooperation and good intentions were synonyms for survival. She had no personal understanding or practical experience with people who were bad on purpose. She couldn't imagine that Big Man and Cyborg were contemplating selling her into the sex trade. She'd followed her father to Earth only 6 months ago, so it was no wonder. I don't mind working for my keep, but I'm in a bit of a hurry today. If you'll tell me your address, I'll see to it you're paid back later. What kind of fools do you take us for? The big man said, stepping toward her. Come on, knock it off. She's just a kid. Shorty interposed himself between them, and then floated skyward as Cyborg grabbed him by the collar and lifted him off. Back off! And tossed him across the platform, his arms flailing. Shorty hit the tracks and slumped unconscious between the rails. What did you do that for? There's no need for such violence. Sayaka rushed to the edge of the platform. Big man grabbed her. Sayaka screamed. Not a scream, but a kya! A martial shout, followed by the grunt. That came from Big Man, his wrist wrenching painfully as he fell onto the platform in an Aikido joint lock. Prick! Cyborg grabbed for her. I am not a man, said Sayaka. She slipped through the alloy steel arms and fired her paralyzer. Okay, I guess that was a response to him calling her a prick. But, I love imagining, I am no man! Boom. The next scream came from her as well. She had misjudged the separation between them and the angle of attack. The beam reflected off Cyborg's chest and hit her squarely. Stupid bitch, my skin and skeleton can withstand 1,000 Gs of force. That toy ain't gonna work on me. He easily hoisted her onto his shoulder. The reflected power of the paralyzer was significantly diminished, so Sayaka was already regaining consciousness. She tried to resist, but her body was too numb to move. Out of the frying pan into the fire. She really was coming to her wit's end. Paying no mind to Sayaka's struggles, the big man walked up, rubbing his side. Damn, what a pain in the ass that chick is. Still, nice piece of work. She'll go for a pretty penny. Easy living for a year, minimum. First thing in the morning, we head to Kabukicho and... That's not going to happen, interrupted a voice from the shadows. There will be no tomorrow for you two. Big Man and Cyborg exchanged puzzled glances, then scanned the dim interior of the station platform. Other than Shorty, still slumped across the tracks, nobody else was there. Big Man pulled the heater from his belt. Come out, wherever you are! Something grabbed their feet. Big Man looked down. His blood ran cold. Two dirty, rust-red hands grew out of the concrete. They didn't break through. The wrists melded seamlessly into the floor. What the? Let go! Big Man tried to pull free and back away. An even stranger apparition appeared in front of him. Not releasing its hold on his ankles, the upper half of a human torso pushed itself out of the floor, like the fast-forward of a sprouting plant. Only when its entire body had floated to the surface did it let go and pop up head first, as if hinged at its feet. It wore the mantle and hood of a Catholic monk that shadowed its face, but its radiating red eyes instantly robbed the spirit from the big man's soul. Robbed the spirit from the big man's soul. This was Doki. Big Man stood ramrod straight. Doki pushed him aside. Cyborg set Sayaka down on the ground and grabbed his heater. His self-confidence was of a fatal variety. 600,000 degrees of red-hot heat engulfed Doki. The waves of heat blew past him, cooking the walls to incandescent temperatures, turning the concrete back into sand. No good. Doki laughed in a low voice. Not a wisp of smoke rose from his hood or mantle. The energy of the physical world had no effect on what came from the domain of the demons. Fear confused Cyborg's judgment. Instead of retreating, he ran forward, aiming at Doki's chin. He threw a right hook with all his strength. At the moment of contact, Doki's body scattered into a cloud of dust and dirt. It swirled around like a tornado of tea and whirled at Cyborg. In the blink of an eye, Cyborg turned into a mud doll. Welcome to my mystical mud inferno. The last words Cyborg heard. Unimaginable pressures shattered the alloy metal frame and pulverized the life support systems. A space cyborg that could withstand thousands of Gs collapsed like a junked automobile, turned into so much scrap iron in a car crusher. Big Man watched as Cyborg was squeezed to half its normal size. At the same time, the mud doll turned white-hot. Doki's mystical mud inferno was a trick crafted in the bowels. Goodness, why am I tripping on words today? A trick crafted in the bowels of the demon realm. Millions of tons of pressure inside the film of mud trapped his opponent at the virtual center of the earth and crushed it to death. The 50,000 degrees of heat reduced Cyborg to his constituent atoms, which were then absorbed into Doki's body. The mud doll disintegrated and returned to Doki's form, though whether this was Doki's true form was anybody's guess. By now, Big Man was ready to scare his own self to death first. He'd picked a fight with a real monster. With a shriek, he ran toward the turnstiles. A small puddle was in his path. When Sayaka had taken him down with the joint lock, a couple of beer bottles had spilled the remaining contents onto the concrete floor. The soles of his shoes touched the puddle, and then the floor wasn't there anymore. The big man yelped. With a concrete-colored splash, he sank down to his waist in spilled beer. In that spot alone, the puddle had turned into an ocean. Still unable to move, Sayaka watched it all. Only demons could do such things. She had to get away. Only the part of her struck by the ricochet remained enfeebled, except it would probably take a good half hour for the numbness to go away completely. From the puddle of beer that had suddenly swallowed a whole human being came cries reminiscent of a man washed overboard and drowning in the Arctic Sea. "Been a while since I've used my Poseidon spell," said Suiki. "But what an awful-tasting person! The flesh is so stiff and hard." "I was looking forward to a meal as well," Doki complained in an irritated voice. "Except for his brain, that last chap was all machine, and it was utterly flavorless as well. I'm sure the same goes for the head. Leave me an arm, at least. You can snack on earthworms. Now this girl, she's a pretty one. Ah, our all-night search has not proved fruitless. It pays to listen to what's going on underground. Once the rite is complete, I'll have the heart and brains. Fine, the liver and eyeballs for me. Well, shall we take her back to Sorcerer's Abode? Incidentally, what does this curious ring do? Leave it be. Nothing these humans prize is of any worth to us." True enough. Doki hoisted Sayaka onto his shoulder. She could feel the damp chill of the earth through the mantle. What do they intend to do with me? It had something to do with a rite or sacrifice that must involve meeting with this sorcerer, but in this condition and with these monsters hanging around, she wouldn't be able to do a thing. Despair filled her heart. Of all things, she had become a prisoner of monsters the first day she visited Shinjuku. She heard Suiki say something. From the faraway sound of his voice, he must be leaving. This terrifying enemy that Master Ra spoke of not long ago. He hasn't shown up yet, apparently. Sayaka was amazed that these creatures would refer to something as terrifying, and an enemy, perhaps. I do not know, whatever sort of chap he is. In the face of my powers, he will fare no better than these humans. Doki spoke in unabashedly confident tones. That is true too, Suki said. Listening to the laughter of the two demons, Sayaka felt a spark of hope begin to grow in her chest. He was coming. With her on his shoulder, Doki went through the turnstiles and climbed the stairs to the exit. Then, on the once again tranquil station platform, a solitary figure appeared. Shorty. He'd been conscious since the demons appeared, but played it safe and pretended to be dead. Damn. Monsters. Killed Ichi and Sav and snatched the cutie as well. No way I'm letting that slide on my turf. You hold on there, miss. I'll rescue you. Muffling his footsteps, Shorty trailed after Doki. Inside the Shinjuku station on the Tokyo Metro Marunouchi line, where his two companions had been felled by magical means unimaginable and unconstrained, a deathly silence returned to the lifeless platform. And that is the end of chapter, or part, as he says, part 3. Getting good there. We got to see some demon stuff finally. There will be more. My favorite demon still hasn't shown up yet, but he will eventually. Mephisto. He's so cool. He gets his own book kind of eventually, sort of. Kind of. Thanks for listening. Still experimenting with times. I think we're gonna aim towards trying some afternoon times. As much as I hate to, I'm really awake and active in the morning, and I'm very sleepy in the afternoon. But my whole audience is available in the afternoon, so I may just have to adjust and see about streaming books at noon or 1, and then doing games at 4 or 5. We'll see. So tomorrow we'll try something like that. I will be back in a little while for Dishonored. Possibly, maybe, or we'll do movies or something. I'm working on Silent Hill Symbolism. We'll see how much I finish and if I have time for game. But I'll be back with something, so. Thank you to all of our members like Daniel, Delvin, Phil, everybody, you're amazing. Thank you for all the support and for checking in, listening. Jeff, Handsome Ratch, thank you guys. Yes, Mephisto is my favorite. He's a very cool character. Mephisto is the very first of what I will call the monstrous beauties of Hideyuki Kikuchi. He has his own tropes that he embraces. He is very fond of incredibly handsome, perfect, beautiful, homoerotic monster men who are unattainable and outside of humanity, and yet so alluring to us we cannot stop wanting them. And Mephisto was the first one. Vampire Hunter D is the famous one, but Mephisto was his first. And literally, I marked a scene in here because it's just... Literally, there's multiple lines where it's like, it didn't matter if you were a man or a woman, you'd have tapped that. He does this really often, and the way he writes about horror in his personal writing, about how much he loves horror in specific movies and films, I always wonder if he didn't have a thing for certain male monster actor, just the way that he's obsessed with them, maybe not sexually, but romantically. He loves monsters a lot, and we're gonna get to some of those descriptions soon. It'll be fun. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you guys next time. Bye.